Most Americans don't say Australia is better than home. They say something else. They say it feels more livable. And that word keeps coming up for a reason most people don't notice at first. It's not about perfection or some utopian dream. It's about something quieter, something that reveals itself slowly in the everyday rhythms of life. It starts with how days unfold. Life in Australia doesn't rush you forward, but it doesn't hold you back either. Things move with a quiet rhythm that makes daily life feel manageable instead of overwhelming. Mornings don't begin with urgency baked into every minute. Commutes, while they exist, don't feel like battles to survive. The coffee shop barista remembers your order and actually takes a moment to chat. The pedestrian crossing gives you enough time to walk without sprinting. These aren't revolutionary changes. They're subtle recalibrations that compound throughout the day. Americans who move here often describe it as finally being able to exhale without realizing they'd been holding their breath for years. There's structure, yes, but it doesn't feel suffocating. There's pace, but it doesn't feel relentless. The entire infrastructure of daily life seems designed with the assumption that people are human beings, not productivity machines. And that shift, small as it sounds, changes everything about how a day feels when your head hits the pillow at night. You're tired from living, not from fighting to live. People notice it in small moments. How conversations don't feel like competitions, how public spaces feel shared instead of crowded, and how no one seems impressed by how busy you are. In fact, being perpetually busy isn't a status symbol here. It's almost seen as poor planning. There's a cultural permission to slow down that Americans find disorienting at first, then deeply relieving. At a backyard barbecue, no one's checking their phone every 3 minutes or talking over each other to dominate the conversation. At the beach, families spread out blankets without territorial anxiety. On public transport, people give up seats without being asked, and it doesn't become a viral moment. It's just normal. The pub isn't loud with people trying to prove something. It's relaxed, communal, genuine. Even workplace culture reflects this. Colleagues ask about your weekend and actually listen to the answer. Lunch breaks are sacred, not something you apologize for taking. This isn't laziness or lack of ambition. Australians work hard. But there's an unspoken agreement that work is part of life, not the point of it. And Americans, especially those from high-pressure cities, feel that difference in their nervous systems before they can articulate it in words. Work exists, ambition exists, but they don't swallow everything else. Americans often say life here feels organized around living, not squeezing life into whatever time is left after emails, meetings, side hustles, and self-optimization routines. In Australia, there's less glorification of the grind. People work to fund their lives, not the other way around. You'll hear colleagues talk about their surf session before work, their weekend camping trip, their kid's soccer game. And these aren't apologetic asides. They're central. The 40-hour work week is generally respected, not seen as a bare minimum for the uncommitted. Taking your full vacation time isn't career suicide. It's expected. Sick days are for being sick, not for proving toughness by working through illness. This recalibration affects everything. Relationships have room to breathe. Hobbies aren't just aspirations you'll get to someday. And rest isn't something you have to earn through exhaustion. Americans describe it as feeling like they've been given permission to be multidimensional people again. Not just workers, not just parents, not just ambitious climbers, but whole people with time for all the pieces that make life rich. And that spaciousness, that room to be human, is what makes Australia feel so livable. If you're enjoying this breakdown and want more honest, experience-based stories about life in different countries, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, especially if you've lived abroad or are thinking about it. Your perspective adds to this conversation, and I read every comment. If this perspective is resonating with you, take a second to subscribe for more real stories about everyday life around the world. Stories that go beyond tourist highlights and dive into what daily existence actually feels like in different places. One American visitor described their first full week in Australia as strangely calm, not because nothing happened, but because nothing felt urgent. They went to work, met friends, ran errands, cooked dinner, went for walks, had conversations that lasted longer than expected. And they realized by Friday that they hadn't felt that constant pressure to hurry all week. No one was honking in traffic, no one was tapping their foot in line. No one made them feel guilty for taking up space or time. The grocery store checkout person asked how their day was going and seemed to genuinely care about the answer. The colleague who invited them to lunch didn't check their phone once during the meal. The evening felt long in the best way, not because they were killing time, but because time felt abundant rather than scarce. And that feeling stayed with them long after they left, like a baseline they hadn't known was possible. A reminder that life doesn't have to feel like a constant race against the clock just to get through another day. Another thing Americans quietly notice is how time feels respected. Even simple plans feel intentional, not rushed, and that changes how people show up. Calmer, more present, less defensive. When someone suggests grabbing coffee, it's not code for a 15-minute obligation squeezed between obligations. It's an actual coffee, maybe an hour, maybe longer, without anyone glancing at their watch or apologizing for taking up your time. Dinner invitations mean dinner. Relaxed, multi-course, conversation that wanders without agenda. There's a cultural understanding that time spent together has value beyond efficiency. This respect for time extends beyond social life. Doctor's appointments start closer to on time. Tradespeople show up in the window they promised. Public services function with a baseline competence that doesn't require you to be a persistent advocate for yourself. Even customer service interactions feel less adversarial. People aren't performing friendliness while seething underneath. There's a baseline of genuine courtesy that makes daily transactions less exhausting. Americans describe feeling less on guard here, less braced for conflict or incompetence. And that constant low-level relaxation changes everything. You stop spending emotional energy anticipating problems, defending your boundaries, or compensating for broken systems. That energy goes back into your life, your relationships, your capacity to be present. And presence, real presence, becomes possible again. Over time, this balance adds up. Australia doesn't demand constant adjustment. It lets people settle into a version of life that feels sustainable, not exhausting. There's no constant cultural whiplash, no sense that you're always behind some impossible standard, no feeling that one wrong move will send everything crashing down. The social safety net isn't perfect, but it exists. Healthcare that won't bankrupt you, education that's accessible, unemployment support that doesn't come with humiliation. This baseline security changes how people move through the world. They're less anxious, less defensive, less desperate. And that collective calm creates a feedback loop. When most people aren't in survival mode, the whole society feels different. Americans notice it in how conflicts get resolved. Less escalation, more reasonableness. They notice it in how public spaces are maintained. Less vandalism, more pride. They notice it in how neighbors interact. Less suspicion, more willingness to help. It's not utopia. There are problems, frustrations, inequalities. But the baseline feels higher. The floor feels sturdier. And for Americans used to precarity as background noise, that sturdiness is profound. They describe it as finally being able to build a life instead of constantly rebuilding after each crisis. And that ability to actually build, to invest in roots and relationships without hedging against disaster, is what makes Australia feel genuinely livable. Americans also notice how life doesn't revolve around proving success. There's less pressure to constantly explain who you are or what you do, and that freedom, subtle but powerful, makes everyday life feel lighter and more human. In the States, what do you do? Often comes within the first 3 minutes of meeting someone, and your answer determines how the conversation unfolds, how much respect you receive, whether people lean in or drift away. In Australia, that question arrives later, if at all, and it's asked with genuine curiosity rather than social sorting. People introduce themselves by their interests, their neighborhood, what they did last weekend. Identity isn't collapsed into occupation. You'll meet someone at a party who turns out to be a surgeon, but they spent 20 minutes talking about their terrible golf game first. The tradie working on your house might have a philosophy degree, and no one treats that as failure. There's less performance, less resume recitation, less anxiety about being impressive enough to deserve basic human warmth. Americans describe it as exhausting to realize how much energy they'd been spending on self-justification, and how relieving it is to just exist without that constant audition. Friendships form differently here, slower maybe, but built on who people actually are. That's why Americans don't call Australia perfect. They call it livable. Not because everything is easy, but because life feels designed to be lived, not endured. There are still traffic jams, bills to pay, bad weather, bureaucracy, days that don't go as planned. Australia has its problems, its frustrations, its contradictions. But the baseline experience of an ordinary day feels fundamentally different. It feels like the system works with you rather than against you, like society expects you to be a whole person rather than a productive unit. Like time is something you inhabit rather than something constantly being stolen. Americans who spend time here often say they didn't realize how tired they were until they finally got to rest. They didn't know how tense they'd been until they felt their shoulders drop. and that recognition stays with them. Some move permanently. Others return home but carry that knowledge of what's possible. If you enjoyed this perspective, subscribe for more honest stories about everyday life around the world, and share in the comments which country feels most livable to you, or what livable even means from where you're standing.